Hi everybody, Steve Paikin here on the 4th floor of 2180 Yonge Street at TVO's headquarters at Yonge and Eglinton. We are getting set for a live chat about all things Ontario and politics. You know, of course, we're in the middle of the 41st general election in Ontario's history. Election date is June the 12th, and I'm happy to take your questions for the next, I don't know how long we're going here, half hour, 45 minutes, whatever, to answer your questions. So let's go. Here's the first one. This is from Peter on Twitter. Why will no other parties than the Greens look at combining education systems? Is it still considered political death? This is a great question, and thanks for getting it started, Peter. I wrote a blog post about this a couple of days ago, actually, going into some of the history on this file. There seems to be in Ontario history a toxic stew whenever political parties tend to, if I can mix the metaphor here, dip their toe into that mix of politics, education, and religion. We remember not too long ago, in 2007, that John Tory, then the PC party leader, saw what in his view was an inequality in the province's education system, namely that Catholics had their choice between a publicly funded secular school system and a publicly funded religious school system, but no other religion had that. And his solution that he put forward in that election was to give public funds to other religions as well, to sort of even out the playing field, if you like. Well, I think the voting public made their views on that policy quite plain in that election. Tory got slapped down pretty badly on it. There was a lot of discontent on his backbench about it. And it perhaps has encouraged the Greens to go in the opposite direction, which is if there is agreement, I'm not sure there is, in their view, if there's agreement, the current system is towards one religion over another. What if we just took the funding away from that religion? Now, the difficulty in that is it's always hard politically to take something away from a group, particularly when they've enjoyed that privilege for 150 years nearly. But the Greens think that they're on a good issue here. In that same 2007 election, their vote went from, I think, 2% to 8% because they ran on this policy in that election. They then didn't run so hard on it the last election, and they went back to 2%. So my hunch is they're going to try to give it some more prominence this time in the hopes of attracting votes from people who still have qualms about the fact that we have this rather anomalous system in the province of Ontario, but one that still has its supporters and one that still a lot of people think works pretty well. Okay, thanks for that, Peter. Let's get the next question up there. Just for what it's worth, Elamina, and let's see what the next one says. Derek says, are you worried about Hudak's vagueness around TVO funding? I think the simplest way to answer this question is, I've worked here for 22 years. I have seen various governments, I have seen various parties make all sorts of pledges, promises, commitments, undertakings as it relates to TVO, and my general rule of thumb has always been not to get involved. We come to every day, we try to put on a good program on the air that night, we try to feed the website with content that our viewers and users and readers find appealing and interesting and relevant, and as hard as it may be to believe this, but I think I speak for everybody here on this, we really don't get involved in the politics of the day in terms of how it affects TVO. We come in, we do our jobs, we are down, governments get elected, and then they make their decisions. I have, during the time I've worked here, I started here in 1992, so there were New Democrats then Conservatives, now Liberals. We have had, as it were, prime funders of all three political party stripes, and we'll just do our jobs and let the chips fall where they may. Okay, next question is from Dino. What effect has the federal foreign investment policy had on Ontario? Is there room for improvement? The federal foreign investment policy. The thing that I don't like about this format is that I'd like to ask Dino a follow-up, and I guess I really can't do that in this situation. Dino, how do I answer that other than to say it was the progressive conservative government 20 years ago that pushed the first free trade agreement through, or I guess it was more, it's 25 years ago now, under Brian Mulroney. When the Liberals came to power, despite trade in the previous decade, they kept it. And free trade has now been endorsed by both the Liberals and the Conservatives. So how does that affect the province of Ontario? The reality is the manufacturing base has really been kicked to the teeth. A high dollar certainly affects Ontario in an adverse way. In some regards. In other regards, a low dollar would affect you in another way. If you're trying to buy American equipment to improve your factory, and the dollar's trading at 67 cents US, as it was once upon a time, that's a pretty onerous investment to make. If the dollar's closer to 90 cents, or as it was for a little while at par, obviously a much easier investment to make. A hard question to answer, and I wish I could do the follow-up, but there we are. Okay, let's grab a sip of water, and then we'll do the next question. This is a question from Jim. Why, with healthcare accounting for almost 50% of the budget, we're not allowed to discuss real changes costs? Shouldn't there be an honest discussion about what constitutes an appropriate level of expenditure? I think the answer is yes. To me, election campaigns, in spite of what Kim Campbell said 21 years ago, are a perfect time to have a discussion about issues because everybody's focused. The party leaders are very focused. There's a competing clash of ideas, if you like, about what's best for the province, and I don't see any difficulty at all. In fact, I would say it's urgent to have a discussion right now about something that takes up so much of the budget. I think the last Ontario budget had healthcare spending at about 42 cents on the dollar, so not quite 50, but clearly if we don't get a handle on those costs and figure out a way to provide high quality care at a reasonable cost, the province is going to be in trouble. Healthcare spending will crowd out everything else. So I'm all for a good discussion about healthcare right now. It seems that Tim Hudak's policies are carrying the agenda, and that means Mr. Hudak's policies that he has put forward obviously are being advanced by him and are also being commented on by the other two candidates. So whether you like his policies or you don't, it seems pretty clear to me that, and to many other observers, that the PCs have certainly led the way on policy discussion, policy initiatives, but so far nothing on healthcare. They've obviously wanted the ballot question to be, who's got the best plan to create jobs? Hudak thinks he does, obviously. The others think they do. Okay, next question's from Jody. Steve, what do you see happening with the casino issue, OLG modernization plan, as a result of this election? An interesting question, only in as much as the timing of it. I think it was a year ago today. If it wasn't today, it was yesterday, but I think it might be a year ago today that Premier Kathleen Wynne fired Paul Godfrey, who was the chair of Ontario Lottery and Gaming, mostly because he wanted to put a casino on Toronto, and Kathleen Wynne, being, I guess, from the progressive side of the Toronto political scene, thought that that was a terrible idea, and there was no middle ground between the two of them, so he got fired. I suspect the big issue, one of the big issues on the casino modernization front today relates to Sault Ste. Marie, where there are a lot of jobs that were transferred from Toronto to the Soo back in the late 1980s by David Peterson's Liberal government. He always thought that was an important way to get good, steady, high-paying, dependable jobs, but because they were in the public sector, you knew they'd be there tomorrow, because OLG wasn't going to go out of business. It was important to get those jobs out of Toronto into areas, frankly, that were, cheaper real estate existed, so you didn't have to rent office space at the corner of Yonge and Bloor, which didn't make a lot of sense, and frankly, to help decentralize. There are hundreds of people in Sault Ste. Marie who depend on those jobs for their livelihoods, and of course all of the spin-off industries that would be affected as well if OLG somehow is privatized or downsized or whatever. So that would certainly be the thing that I'm keeping my eye on as it relates to Ontario Lottery and Gaming. Okay, next question is from somebody whose initials simply say LH. If the PCs don't win, presumably Hudak will be out as leader. Who is waiting in the wings to replace him, and is there any chance that there are any red Tories left? Okay, some interesting questions about the present and future of the PC party. I think the conventional wisdom is that it's win or bust for Tim Hudak. He's already had one chance. In politics nowadays, you don't get three chances. He's getting a second chance. He did improve the PC's seat count last time, we should point out, in 2011. He held the McGuinty Liberals to a minority government, admittedly only one seat short. He did improve his party's position. He seems to have a lot of wind in his sails this time. Whether you like his platform or whether you don't, he certainly conveys the impression that he deeply believes in it. Takes no joy is the phrase he uses in having to lay off 100,000 public servants in order to achieve what he says is the imperative goal of balancing the budget in 2 years rather than 3, as the Liberals and New Democrats would. But you're right, if he loses this election, he's out. Who's waiting in the wings to replace him? I can throw a few names out there that one hears percolating around conservative circles. The first, I would say, is Vic Fedeli, who's the former MPP, former sitting member for the riding of Nipissing. He's a former mayor of North Bay. He is a self-made millionaire, has, I think, a lot of appeal, not just with small c conservatives, but with those red Tories you referenced as well. He's the finance critic. He's a rookie MPP, and yet in time he had a job. So I think he's at the top, if not near the top of most people's lists. I think Lisa MacLeod from Eastern Ontario would kick the tires on running for the leadership. She wins her seat by, I think, more votes than maybe any other MPP in the Ontario legislature. She's young, she's female. Those are both things in her favor in politics today. So I think you'd want to add her name to the list. And then there are always the names that you don't necessarily think of. For example, Kelly Leitch is somebody who has a long history in the Conservative Party. She's a cabinet minister in Stephen Harper's government right now. But if, for whatever reason, the leadership were to come available in Ontario, might she take a look at it? Well, she did last time it was available, so there's no reason to think she wouldn't take a look at it this time as well. And then you get some real wild cards, like, for example, Christine Elliott, who ran for it last time. The scuttlebutt I hear is that Christine Elliott, if the Conservatives don't, Jim Flaherty's former seat, Whitby, Oshawa, and go federal. She ran for the leadership last time against Hudak, came third. Not sure she'd try that again. And again, totally out of, normally you say left field, but I guess since they're conservatives, we'll say out of right field. Tony Clement is a name that comes up again and again. He's run for leadership of both the provincial party and federal party in the past. Was never successful, but of course has that much more experience under his belt now. And although his certainly goal at the moment and orientation at the moment is federal, one has to suspect that he has a very safe seat in Parry Sound, Muskoka, a very high profile, and that he might, he will no doubt be pressured to try to go for the Ontario job if it becomes available, and whether he'd be interested is another question. Anyway, those are the names that immediately come to mind. I'm sure I've forgotten some, but those are the names that immediately come to mind if Tim Hudak falters on the... Next question, this was from Jason. The polling has been all over the place. Yes, it has, since the election started, and even before. What do you think is really going on? A very hard question to answer because, of course, all the pollsters swear by their methodology, and yet I'm not sure how in the same... I don't know how, a day apart, on the one hand, Forum has the Liberals up by 5, and the next day, Ipsos has got the Conservatives up by 8. I don't know how that happens, other than either one poll is a rogue poll, which is possible, right? The pollsters always say our methodology works 19 times out of 20. It's always possible one of those is a 20th poll. The other possibility is one never knows what specifically or exactly makes public opinion move. We can come to some, surmising after the election is over, but you never really know what does it. And it may be something and something good happened on the Hudak campaign when Ipsos was out in the field, and that's reflected in that poll. I mean, that poll also shows the Liberals and Conservatives basically tied in the GTA, which, on the face of it is very tough to believe because this has been, particularly the 416, a red Liberal bastion for 10 years. The Conservatives, if you go back, How far back do you have to go? You have to go back to 1999 to find the last time the Conservatives won any seats at all of the 22 in the 416. So that's basically 0 for 66 over the last 3 general elections. They finally broke that jinx with the Etobicoke Lakeshore by-election, and Doug Holliday, the former deputy mayor of Toronto, now holds that seat, but that was a by-election victory. So that's the first time since 1999 that the Conservatives managed to win a seat in the 416. The notion that those two parties would somehow be tied today doesn't feel right, but then again, snapshot a few days ago. It doesn't tell you what's happening today, and it certainly doesn't tell you what's going to be happening tomorrow or next week or on the 12th of June. So take the polls for what they're worth. Diefenbaker had a great line about this. You've heard it before. Polls are for dogs. We know what dogs do with them. Okay, here's a question from, it just says, a guest. Do you feel Hudak is making positive gains, addressing issues, questioning his leadership, trust, competency, and abilities? I do. I think I said it actually on the air the day he came in here for an interview a couple of days ago, and the day we put his platform under the microscope, which was, I've known Tim Hudak since he was 27 years old. I have seen him as a relatively junior cabinet minister in previous Conservative governments. I've seen him win the leadership of his party. I've seen him make a lot of bad mistakes in the last 2011 election campaign, and I've seen him improve his performance skills and his since then. The Tim Hudak, who was on stage at the convention center a couple of days ago, was very solid. He was poised, he was polished, he presented his party's platform extremely well. The Tim Hudak on the subway, however, who froze when his staff were told that you haven't got a permit and we got to kick you off the subway system because you're not allowed to be here without a permit, that guy who had a frozen smile on his face because he seemed terrified about not knowing what to do under those circumstances, I think is still a concern for many voters in Ontario. And I have nothing to judge that on other than what I pick up in the air, the anecdotes I hear from people who stop me on the street, who stop me on the subways. You know, throughout the course of the year I get all over the province, and there is still something about Hudak that rubs people the wrong way. And I'm not talking about his policies right now, I'm talking about him. You've seen the polls that show that he's the least trusted, least popular leader of 3 major party leaders. Andrea Horwath narrowly leading Kathleen Wynne for that popularity contest, if you like. And what Hudak, I think, has done instead is to take what is a problem and turn it into a virtue. And his line has been, I'm never going to be the most popular guy who's going to tell you everything you want to hear. I'm going to be the tough guy who's going to make the hard decisions that we need to make. So that's what, I guess that's called taking lemons and turning it into lemonade. And obviously I'll be fascinated to see on the 12th of June how people react to that. Okay, next question. This one's from Chris. Chris asks, do you see any advantage or not to there being 2 like-minded parties in philosophy being in power in Ontario and Quebec, such as 2 Liberal governments? I'm not sure this is a problem. I mean, the reality is a lot of this partisanship are marketing labels that help parties get elected. But once parties are in office, they're the reality and the party you're in. There are only so many different approaches you can take to fixing the economy. As long as I've lived, I could not imagine Stephen Harper and Jim Flaherty presenting a budget with a $55 billion deficit. But they did, because they, in their own wisdom, concluded that we cannot be such hard noses on the issue of balancing the budget that we end up taking 5 points of growth off the economy and sending people onto the unemployment lines and putting people on welfare because we have an ideological position that suggests that budgets always have to be balanced. So they changed. Similarly, we saw in the last Liberal government of Dalton McGuinty, and now to a much lesser extent, but to some extent anyway, Kathleen Wynne, an attempt, I'm sure Conservatives would say by Liberal standards, which they would not respect, an attempt to get spending more under control. And in fact, I have the budget of Ontario right here, and I looked this up the other day, and there is a fact there is, in fact, a chart in the budget which shows, if I can find it, there it is right there. Put this up for everybody to see. That's a chart that shows that spending per capita by the province of Ontario is the smallest of any province in Canada. Now, the Liberals keep saying it, and there it is in black and white, but that's a chart that shows program spending per capita in Canada, and Ontario has the lowest. So for those who say the Liberals have no story to tell on keeping spending under control, they point to the budget papers and say not true. Obviously, Mr. Hudak believes that's a half measure, and he'd like to balance the books and rein in spending even more tightly sooner. Does it matter if Liberals are in power? I think, I'm trying to remember now, 10 years ago, we had Liberals in power in Ottawa, Liberals in power in Quebec, Jean Charest, Liberals in power in Queen's Park, Dalton McGuinty. Didn't seem to me like they got along a whole heck of a lot better than when Conservatives are in power in Ottawa today and Liberals are in power in those two provinces. There's an old expression, where you stand depends on where you sit. There are imperatives that any provincial government, regardless of stripe, has to deal with, and there are imperatives that any federal government has to deal with. And it doesn't matter what party they are, by nature of the jobs, they're going to clash. Okay, next question. This one's from Andrew. Andrew asks, what effect do you think Tim Hudak's announcement of cancelling the LRTs in Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, and Brampton will have on the campaign? Andrew, I hate to do this, but I'm one of these kind of guys who doesn't like to make predictions about what impact do you think something's going to have. I'm never so presumptuous as to think I know what voters are going to think about one thing or another. I think we and let them tell us, rather than we assume how they're going to react. Let the voters tell us what they think about that. The great thing about this election campaign, that you could argue was not present in the 2011 campaign, is that we've got, I'm going to say 4, because I want to put the Greens into the mix here too. We've got 4 very different visions for the future of the province of Ontario. We have different visions on how to create jobs. We have different visions on what to do on energy. We have different visions on what to do about taxation. We have different visions on how many people ought to be working in the public service of Ontario. We have different visions on transportation and infrastructure investment. Tim Hudak had a press conference this morning in front of Union Station where he confirmed the many billions of dollars that the Liberals would like to spend electrifying the GO transit lines to make the improvements they want to make. He would not make. He says we don't have that money right now. We can do some other things to make GO better for commuters. That's one of them that he's prepared to make right now. And as you've pointed out, he's also decided that his top priorities are a downtown Toronto subway relief line as opposed to these LRTs up on Finch or in Mississauga. So this is the great thing about this election campaign. There's a real choice. And I'm fascinated to see what people choose. Next question, this one from Colin. Why would anyone who is not a simpleton or a masochist reward this Liberal government with their vote? Do you really think people are afraid of any other alternative? Could things really be worse with a PC, NDP, or even Green Party government? Well, I think you've put your finger on one of the key conundrums that the Liberal campaign has, and that is they are clearly trying to present themselves as a new government. Kathleen Wynne has only been Premier for 15 months, and to some extent they can make that claim. She's a new Premier with new priorities, with new people around her. If she were to win the next election, but she presents herself as a new, changed government. Her critics obviously say she is the 11th year of Liberal governments, the previous 10 of which have some good stories to tell, but have many, more recently, bad stories to tell. So yes, that's, Colin, you've put your finger, I think, on what one of the key ballot questions is going to be, which is this a new Premier who deserves a chance to implement her agenda, or is this just somebody who's tried to put a fresh coat of paint on something that is an old, beat-up jalopy that is best sent out to the garbage heap? That's a great question for everybody to answer. The other thing is, you know, the Liberals have been doing reasonably well in the polls lately, and I wonder if part of that is Some people in this province will be scared off by the Hudak agenda. Some people in this province, particularly those who have always supported the NDP, they wonder where the party that used to be the conscience of the legislature has gone. They wonder where the party that cared so much about social justice has gone. And if you read Carol Gore in the Toronto Star this morning, she focuses on this very point, that in her efforts to appeal to more middle-class voters and businesses as well, Andrea Horwath has jettisoned a lot of the former rhetoric you would have heard from an NDP leader on the campaign trail. So we also have to allow for the possibility, Colin, that while people may have a lot of problems with the Liberals, they may have larger problems with the other parties. And that may be part of the reason why the Liberals are still in a competitive position in this race. Okay, sip of water here. And this says, question from someone in Scarborough, which I would never call it that because we love Scarborough here. Wouldn't it be better strategy for Hudak to move more towards the center than the far right? Do you think he has or is voting PC? What exactly is his strategy? Okay, interesting question, and here's what I think the strategy is. I think Tim Hudak ran in 2011 on a more focus group tested, here's what you really should do to attract some of those more moderate voters. And I'm not sure he felt in his gut that it was the right way to go. And the inauthenticity of that campaign rang out. And he ran on a lot of stuff that, as it turned out, were big political turkeys. You remember the foreign workers and the what many people called a homophobic literature drop in Toronto in the dying days of the campaign, and the chain gangs and all this stuff. And some of that stuff was meant to be appealing to the Conservative Party base, but the rest of his platform was considered not relevant and not serious. The lesson he learned from that is, I'm going to run on who I am and what I believe in, and my time right I am. If you don't want me and my timing is off, okay, I can live with that too. And that, coming to that realization, I think has put a lot of wind in his sails and made him a better campaigner this time than he was last time. Now you ask, should he have put a few bones in the platform that might have appealed to the Red Tories? He could do that. He could have done that, except that I don't think he believes in his heart that that's the way to go. So he hasn't done that. I asked John Capobianco, who's a longtime PC Party stalwart, on the program the other night, what's the Tory base in Ontario? And he said 30%. Well, we all know you don't win elections with 30%. So my question was, how are you going to pick up the other 8 or 9 or 10 that you need to win? And I think the Hudak campaign team's view is, we stay true to our principles, we keep our core, and we'll steal a few percent from the NDP, we'll steal a few percent of disaffected Liberals, we might even steal a few Greens as well, and that's we pick up the other 10%. It's risky, because certainly a red Tory looking at the PC Party platform today wouldn't necessarily see anything there designed to appeal to them directly. So it's a big gamble, but it's an authentic gamble. And sometimes, as we saw in 1995 with Mike Harris, those kind of authentic gambles can pay off. Okay, next one. This one's from Andrew. Can't the other leaders use the Drummond report as a means of attacking the Wynne government, the lack of implementation, and so on? Just to remind everybody, Don Drummond was a former official in the Ministry of Finance federally. He helped Paul Martin balance the federal books, and then the Ontario government, the Liberal government, tasked him with coming up with chairing a committee that essentially came up with a lot of different ideas, dozens and dozens of ideas for saving money. Drummond's report, the Liberals say, has been 80% implemented. What I don't know is whether 80% of recommendations or 80% of the potential dollars those recommendations represented. I think it's probably the former, because there are still some big ticket items that Drummond recommended that have not been implemented. For example, delaying full-day kindergarten, for example, ending the Ontario Clean Energy Benefit, which is essentially the province of Ontario borrowing $1 billion in order to help subsidize the worst energy hogs in the province, if I can put it that way. People with big homes get a big subsidy to run their heaters at full blast in the wintertime and their air conditioners at full blast in the summertime. Frankly, the Green Party has been out there saying this makes no sense at all. It doesn't encourage people to conserve. It merely encourages them to be more wasteful with electricity. Hudak says he'll get rid of that clean energy benefit. He also says there are, if you look at his one-sheet platform that came out the other day, he said there are 7 recommendations in all that Drummond has recommended that the Liberals have not fulfilled. So, again, we're talking a lot about Tim Hudak today, but that's because, frankly, he's the guy who's had the most policy out there. And I think his position sort of is, the Liberals asked Drummond for the recommendations. They won't implement them. I will. I think that's it in a nutshell. Here's a question from Peter. Following the Supreme Court's decision regarding the Canadian Senate, have the current party leaders given any opinion on its role and structure and their potential willingness to work with other premiers on constitutional issues regarding the said Senate? I think the short answer is no. The Supreme Court decision on the Senate came down so close to the beginning of the Ontario election campaign that I'm not sure that the party leaders in Ontario have had any opportunity whatsoever to really give this any serious thought. And so for that reason, I mean, Senate reform obviously has not come up in a provincial election campaign, nor would it. The federal government at the moment sees its plan, the plan federally to abolish the Senate is dead in the water. Frankly, the only plan out there right now that could be implemented is the federal Liberal Party's plan, which requires the Prime Minister to appoint an eminent body of civilians who would pick senators or who would recommend senators for the Prime Minister to appoint. That would be legal. Whether there'll be any discussion about that after the Ontario election, I'm sure there will be, but at the moment, nothing. Another sip of water. Okay, this is a question from Stephen with a PH. In your discussions with others about this election, what is the single main issue that keeps popping up? Well, I'll tell you, since he made his announcement in Barrie several days ago, the one thing that I get asked about all the time is the 100,000 layoffs that the Conservatives say is imperative in order for the province of Ontario to balance its books. And here we are again talking about a Tim Hudak policy, which the agenda, policy, he's clearly the guy who has set the agenda in the election campaign. He has, I think, so far successfully made jobs in the economy the ballot question, and he clearly believes he has the best plan in order to answer that. I think one of the things that analysts are going to be asking themselves after this election campaign is, was Tim Hudak too honest about putting that 100,000 figure out there? There was a way to finesse that, whereby he might have said, for example, all of the things he said about tax cuts and helping corporations and so on. There might have been a way to say, we're going to take a look at every ministry, we're going to take a look at the size of the public service, but I can't tell you right now what we'd do. But suffice to say, we'd take a look at making sure it was efficient and been able to get away with that. That might have been a more elegant way to finesse this issue and might have taken him out of the crosshairs, which he is clearly in now, ever since he much more clearly said, I'm going to fire 100,000 people. Clearly the other two parties, the three parties, we'll put the Greens in there too, have said that was a political blunder, because what you've done is you've made sure that the 1 million people who work in the broader public sector, and by that I mean municipalities, universities, colleges, schools, hospitals, etc. You've got all the people who work in that sector afraid that they're going to be part of that 100,000 to be laid off, and if they're not afraid, they're certainly afraid for their brother or cousin or sister-in-law who may work in the broader public service, and they worry about their job. So it will, to me, it will be one of the key questions I want analyzed after this campaign is figure out there, make Hudak look stronger, more confident, more sure of his plan, and therefore attract votes, or did it scare more people away and cost him the election? Fascinating question. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, here's I'm told a different question from a different Andrew. Will election voter fatigue set in quickly between this provincial election and the municipal election and finally the federal election? And who benefits from voter fatigue? We talked about this a little bit on the air the other night. If you can imagine right now, and I think this is unprecedented in my lifetime, but I'm prepared to be told I'm wrong on this. In two Toronto ridings right now, and of course some other ridings maybe outside of Toronto, in Scarborough, Agincourt, and Trinity Spadina, there is a federal by-election, a provincial election, and of course the municipal election. The mayor's race and the local councillors' races are all happening right now. 3 elections all at once. I know, for example, having talked to a few of the mayoral campaigns in the Greater Toronto area, that they are simply standing down. They're canceling announcements. They are keeping their heads down because it's just too complicated and confusing right now. The provincial election is the one that is commanding most of the attention, and there's no point in competing with it, they say. So that's why we've heard nothing from the Ford campaign at all, less from the Tory and Chow campaigns, less from Stinson Sognacki in Toronto. And I think the same goes with, for example, the Mississauga campaigns, where it's Mahoney against Crombie. They're also doing fewer events as a result. Who benefits if the confusion of all of these simultaneous elections is a problem? Well, the team that benefits is the team that has the most loyal, fiercely determined supporters. And traditionally, those supporters have been Conservatives and New Democrats. They are the people who, we have been told over the years, are the most ideological, are the most fervently passionate, truly in their cause, and they're not to be able to get their people out. The Liberal Party has always been sort of the moderate, pragmatic middle party, and as a result, it hasn't had the kind of fire in the belly from enough of its voters necessarily to get out to the polls. Now, that obviously can be an exception. In the late 1990s, Liberals had no problem getting voters out to the polls in order to take on Mike Harris. This is a different election with a different time. That may play out in a very strange way, and it's a very good question to see how it does play out. Grab another sip of water. Question from simply a guest. Is there an appetite for a provincial pension plan, or are the Liberals off base here? I have not seen any numbers on this that dive deep into whether or not people like the specific Ontario registered pension plan that the Liberal budget, which has passed. But I have seen polling on the generic effort to enhance retirement income security, and it tests very well. People are worried about whether they'll have adequate income security after they retire. They know the Canada Pension Plan at the most is going to bring them, whatever the number is, I think $12,500 a year. They know obviously that's not enough to live on. But the flip side of this is, of course, it would require employers to make a contribution, and it would require, employees to make a contribution. This again for only for those people who don't currently have a workplace pension plan. So I don't know how it's going to play out. I'm giving that answer a lot today because I don't know what voters care more about: making sure that there are no more deductions from their paycheck, or making sure that when they retire in whatever it is, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they've got adequate money to live on at the time. It's just under the surface of this 2014 Ontario election campaign. Next question, this one's from Kent. What are the chances that in some ridings the vote is split between the Liberals and the NDP, and as a result the Tories win that riding? What are the chances? The chances are in a first-past-the-post system, this can be replicated 107 times over. That's how many ridings we have. Absolutely. It is absolutely I won't even say a possibility, a probability that all 3 parties could win seats based on the splits. And I think the best example of this was in 1990 when Bob Rae won a majority government for the NDP, 74 seats, I think, if memory serves, on the basis of 37.6% of the total votes. I mean, conventional wisdom in Ontario was that you always had to get 41, 2, 3% of the votes in order to get a majority government. and Ray did it with 37.6. In 2011, got that exact same 37.6, and he only got 53 seats. He was only good for a minority government, which is, generally how the seat breakout would play when you only get that smaller percentage of the total votes. And how did Bob Ray do it? Well, he did it a lot on the splits. There were a lot of ridings where the votes were so evenly distributed among the other two parties that the NDP was able to come up the middle and win a lot of seats with just 34, 35, 36, 37% of the vote. And if you can do that across the province, you can win a majority government with far fewer than the majority of the vote. Next question. This one's from Chris. Do you think that the re-amalgamation of the hydro companies, given the disaster of the former Ontario Hydro, will hurt Horwath, as she announced she would do today? And I'm told this is the last question. Okay. Ontario Hydro was this behemoth for many, many decades that essentially was in charge of the generation and the transmission of electricity in the province of Ontario. And it did it through many different means, of course. There's the Niagara Falls hydroelectricity generation. It did it through coal-fired generating stations. It did it overwhelmingly, 50%, through the operation of nuclear power plants. And, of course, when Mike Harris's Conservatives came in, they decided to break up on what was then called Ontario Hydro into two separate companies, OPG, Ontario Power Generation, as the name suggests, which was in charge of generating the electricity, and Hydro One, which was the transmission lines. That's how you got power to people. I don't know anybody, and I've talked to a lot of experts on this, I don't know anybody in Ontario today, Conservative, Liberal, New Democrat, or Green, who believe that the current structure today makes sense. I have heard on the hustings, Andrew Horwath and Tim Hudak talk about the fact that we have numerous, maybe 5, agencies of the government with oversight responsibility on this issue. I have heard the Hudak Conservatives and the Horwath New Democrats say they would amalgamate, combine, rationalize, somehow cut down the number of those agencies. I have heard Liberals say it's a mishmash as well and makes no sense at all. So there's a pretty good chance that something's going to take place. Whoever wins this election, even easier to do, obviously, if it's a majority government, as it relates to the generation and transmission of electricity in Ontario. Now, would they put the two companies back together and recreate Ontario Hydro? I don't know. There's any number of different models of what you could do right now. But I think everybody I've talked to agrees it's a dog's breakfast right now. Done. And with that, speaking of done, I think we are. Great questions, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Daniel, are we going to do this again during the campaign at some point?
We're definitely going to try to do this at least one more time during the campaign, if not several more times.
Okay, so that's...
Hi, I'm the online editor.
That's Daniel Kitts, our online editor, who is the guy...
And I wasn't here the whole time. I just came in the last minute. So don't worry, I'm not looking over Steve's shoulder 100% of the time.
Just came in to give me the hook. So, yes, delighted to do this again because I'm absolutely fascinated by what you folks are interested in, and we'll try to do my best to answer those questions as we go through. And thanks a lot for all the great questions today. Really fascinating. See you on TV tonight.